In this video we're going to have a look at the biomes and how they're generated in MC Terrain. The biome code was taken from an excellent article found here. It's had a few minor modifications to fit in with MC Terrain, but I would recommend reading through these articles in their entirety if you want to find out any more about how the code actually works. The biome mapping is based on the Whittaker model, which is mentioned here, which is a standard model that takes the temperature and the precipitation and works out what the biome should be based on those two figures. Now back in MC Terrain we can visualize what the biomes are by going onto the biome texture, and if you go to game object and align the view, and just go back a bit, and if we highlight the biome manager and then preview biome layout, then we'll be able to see what the biomes will look like in the game when it runs. There, so now we've got our biome showing, with each pixel of the texture representing one chunk of the terrain. And the little red dot up here, if I maybe zoom in a tiny bit, there, that's where your player position is set to start. So when you start the game, your player will be standing in that position relative to the rest of the world. We've got some settings over here that we can alter to change the way the map's laid out. So they're pretty standard, so you've got octaves and frequency for the noise, for the height, the heat and the moisture, and then you've got how far up the value between 0 and 1 each type of terrain will appear. So we can do a few examples. So if we change the octaves for the height map really high and the frequency really high, and then preview it again, then we'll see the difference in the way the map looks. There, so we can see the map has a lot smaller regions rather than the bigger regions we had before, because the noise is smaller. So if we set those values back to where they were, then the map will come back as it was when we generate. The height here can easily be demonstrated with the water values. So anything in the height from 0 to 0.2 will be deep water, anything from 0.2 to 0.3 will be shallow water, and so on and so on. So if I was to take the water values down to 0 and regenerate, then we'd have a map that didn't have any water in at all, so it's quite easy to visualize that one. There, so we got no water at all. So again, we can put those back where they were. And the same applies to the heat and the moisture maps. For example, if we were to take the moisture right down, so we've only got very dry values, I'll put them to the extremes because it's easier to demonstrate then. And then we preview. Then we get a large desert area and not so much of everything else. Again, we can return those to their previous values. And then if I generate again, so we get back to where we were. Now, it may not be so obvious to see, but this is actually a wrapping map and wrapping texture in both directions. So when the game runs, as the player gets to the edge, it will wrap round to the other side and the chunks will be generated accordingly, so it does effectively give you an endless map if that's what you want. However, I've added up here the option of adding a sea border in, so if we do that and then preview the biome layout again, it will add a sea border around the edge. So depending on what sort of game you want to create, you could then effectively trap your player onto a large island, and then he wouldn't be able to get off unless he had aeroplanes or boats. If of course he did, then he would wrap round and then find an identical second island. Now these textures are just simply transparent textures with the colours of the water added to them, but you must make sure if you're going to change them that the colours of the water match the colours that you've added to your deep water and shallow water down here, which we'll have a look at in a moment. Now the biome names in the Whittaker model, as we saw earlier, have the actual names for the world, like savanna, tundra, ice, desert and so on, but I've abstracted the names out, so you might not want to have actual real world biomes. You might want to have a lava world, you might be on a planet, so you might want a moonscape for example. So I've abstracted the names out, so you've got hot dry, hot mid, hot wet and so on, with the first word being the temperature and the second word being the precipitation. And if we go into scripts, biomes, map generation, generator, then you can see the table of the temperature versus the precipitation and how the enums are named accordingly, which follows the Whittaker model. And if you go into enums, you've got the enum there and you've got the Whittaker model name commented next to it for convenience, so it's easy to map one to the other if you want to. So back in Unity, if we go to Biomes Data, then here we've got all the scriptable objects for each of the biome types. Now there's 11 biome types altogether, which is the 9 Whittaker models and the deep water and shallow water. Now you have to populate all of them. The game expects them all to be there, and that solves any issues with tiny areas that might be generated that didn't have a scriptable object associated to them. But if you wanted to have, say, a lot of desert and you didn't want to have all of the other biomes, you can just put in the same one like this into lots of different places. So if we put it into the first 4 now and then hit preview biome layout, we'll see a lot more desert than we had before. There, so you can alter it by just repeating the scriptable objects if you want to. Right, if I put them back as they were, then we can regenerate and see the map as it was before. And if we click on one of the scriptable objects, then we can see the settings up here. You can give it any name you want. I've chosen to match it to the Whittaker model name of Savannah, and the map colour is the colour it will appear on the map there. The terrain material, that needs to be a triplanar shader, so you get the different texture showing depending on the angle of the terrain, so you get the rocks and the grass showing, otherwise you just get a single colour for the whole terrain. Now terrain height, that's a multiplier that's multiplied to the noise to increase or decrease the height of the hills. in that biome area. I'd recommend in adjacent biome types to keep the number within 1 or 2 of each other, otherwise you'll get really sharp cliff edges between the terrain types, which might be quite jarring as the player comes across them. Now this is the grass prefab for this particular terrain. We'll look at the grass prefab in a different video. It uses GPU instancing to allow a lot of grass to be put onto the terrain without affecting the speed of the game. And here you can decide if you want grass to appear in the chunk. If it's a desert chunk, for example, you wouldn't want grass, so you'd untick that and then you wouldn't need to worry about giving it a grass prefab. Now the tree, bush, rock and stone settings all work in exactly the same way, so we'll just look at one of them. They use a Poisson disk sampling method. If you're not familiar with that, there's a lot of information on the internet, and a particularly good video can be found here on Sebastian Larg's YouTube channel. If you're interested in how that particular algorithm works, then I highly recommend you watch that video. The settings here are for the algorithm. So you've got the density, which is how dense the trees are in the chunk. You've got the radius, which is how close the trees could be positioned to each other. And then this one is whether trees will appear in the chunk at all. So the lower the number, the more chance of chunks without any trees, which makes the trees appear more patchy. So you could put the density quite high and the radius quite low to make really tight packed groups of trees, and then you could make them only appear in a few chunks to make them really sort of clumpy and patchy. The same settings apply to the bush, the rock and the stone settings. This last one, if you tick that, you'll only get one single tree per chunk, so you'll get very spread out trees. And in here you just drag in the prefab for the tree that you want to display, and you can have an array of them here. If you have more than one prefab, it will pick them randomly using the same seed as the rest of the game, so every time you run you will get exactly the same trees in the same positions. That's it for this video. Check out the website for more videos on how to set up MC terrain, how to add the scenery, and also how to add water into the game.